storm in a concrete cup. It was raining inside, and no one could figure out why. The residents of the third floor of the flat block had awoken that morning to find the hallway carpet sodden with water as though a flood had occurred. The only problem with this was the fact that they were indeed on the third floor of the block, and also the halls were all internal. They'd emerged from their respective flats, feet sloshing in over an inch of water, to find a small yet perfectly formed storm cloud hovering just below the ceiling of the main hall. A steady torrent of rain fell from it, drenching the walls and carpets before flowing down the stairwell like a waterfall. "What the hell is it?" Tony from number 38 inquired, shielding his eyes from the downpour as he looked up at the cloud. "It's a rain cloud is what it is," said Colin from 31, his pyjama bottoms rolled up to his knees. "Pretty angry looking too." "I can see that," said Tony. "Only, what's it doing here?" "Maybe it came in through a window," Mrs. Shaw from 35 said, as she cradled her young daughter on her hip. The girl, at least, seemed to be delighted and was waving her hands back and forth to catch the drops. "Clouds don't fly in through windows," Tony scoffed. "That's not how it works." "Apparently it is," said Colin, wringing out the hem of his nightshirt. Tony walked to the end of the hall and looked out the window. Not only was it firmly shut, but the weather outside was fine and bright, not another cloud in the sky. "We're going to have mould," said Mrs. Shaw. "Has anyone called the caretaker?" "Yeah, right," said Tony with a rasp of his lips. "The place would have to get struck by lightning before that guy comes around on a Saturday." As if on cue, the cloud emitted a clap of thunder, and a tiny fork of lightning shot from within it and struck the sodden carpet with a hiss. Mrs. Shaw's little girl didn't like this, and she instantly started to whine and fidget. "We can't have it doing that," said Colin. "It'll short the whole building out." "Maybe you can blow it away," said Mrs. Shaw, trying to soothe her daughter with a round of bounces. The girl's nappy was completely waterlogged and had swollen to almost twice its size, so as each bounce produced a hideous squelch. Tony stood directly beneath the cloud. He then jumped up and waved his hands around. "Don't do that," said Colin. "It might zap you." As Tony's hands passed through it, some of the cloud did start to disperse, thin wisps separating from the main mass and then disappearing. "Go and get some towels or sheets," he said to Colin. "We can try and waft it away." Colin went into his flat and returned with a large bath towel. Taking one end each and pulling it tight across the breadth of the hallway, he and Tony advanced on the cloud, waving the towel up and down. This actually worked pretty well, and they were able to corner the cloud against the hallway window. Tony popped the catch and opened the window up wide. The resulting gust of wind caught hold of the cloud, sucked it out, and carried it off over the car park. They both looked at each other and laughed, though the mood was swiftly broken by the sound of a voice coming from the adjacent stairwell. "Would anyone care to tell me what on earth is going on here?" "That was Stephen," said Colin. "You know him, from 44? Tony nodded. He knew Stephen all too well. The self-appointed block representative and all-around miserable old sod. Among his many accomplishments since moving into the block were the successful banning of trick-or-treaters and a peer review process regarding musical doorbells. "I suppose we'd better go up and see if he's okay," said Tony. Colin nodded, but Mrs. Shaw's face fell, and she hefted her daughter back up onto her hip. "Oh dear," she said with a wholly insincere-looking smile. "Looks like someone needs changing." As Tony and Colin made their way up to the next floor, they noticed a sudden and dramatic change in temperature. When they reached the halfway point, Tony held a hand out in front of him. It was definitely colder, though as he drew his hand back, it became warmer again. "You feel that?" he said to Colin, who nodded and rubbed his hands against his upper arms. Their clothes were still wet from their confrontation with the cloud, and the drop in temperature wasn't helping matters. As they turned onto the second part of the stairs, they were astonished to find a dusting of snow on each step, not just ice or slush, but actual virgin snow, like a layer of icing sugar. "Stephen!" Tony called out, taking a firm hold of the banister as he set a foot down on the first snowy step. "Are you still there?" "Of course I am," Stephen replied. "I'm stuck in here." They came up onto the fourth-floor hallway and found that, unlike the water which had overrun their own hall, it was covered in snow. It lay 1/2 foot or so thick on the hall carpet and had collected into large drifts in the doorways of each flat. They looked up and saw that there were clouds here too, though these were far darker than the one they'd encountered before and were blocking out the light from the ceiling lamps, leaving the entire hallway in overcast gloom. Turning their attention to Stephen's flat, they saw that he tried to open his door, only for the drift which had built up against it to fall in, wedging it partly open. Stephen himself, dressed in just a bathrobe, looked out at them from the gap and gestured down at the waist-high pile before him. "You're not stuck, you old moaner," said Tony, trying to keep from laughing. "You just climb over it." "Forgive me for not being in the mood for mountaineering," Stephen said, looking far from amused, "but I can't get through this gap. You pair come and help me." They approached the door slowly, Colin hissing and gasping with each step as his feet, still clad in just sodden slippers, sank down into the packed snow up to his ankles. They dug into the drift with their hands and soon managed to get enough out for the door to be fully opened. "So," said Tony, tucking his now cold-reddened hands under his armpits, "it's a problem with the air conditioning." "I seriously doubt that," said Stephen, emerging from his flat and looking up at the snow-swelled clouds churning above them. "This is some oddball stuff going on here, and I think I know who's to blame." Tony and Colin looked at each other and shrugged. "Him up on the 6th floor," said Stephen. "The dodgy fellow who never comes to the block meetings. This is just like the time with that chemistry nonsense of his." Tony shrugged again, still not following. "This was before you moved in, Tony," Stephen continued, "but you remember, don't you, Colin? When he let out all that yellow smoke that peeled everyone's wallpaper off? This is just like that. Or when he tapped into the whole block's TV signal so that every channel showed—" He broke off and pulled a sour face. "Well, that doesn't bear describing." "Nah," said Colin. "You just don't like him because he had that door knocker shaped like a you-know-what." "It wasn't shaped like one," Stephen snapped. "It was one. But we're getting off the point. Let's go up there and see how he explains himself." Tony looked over his shoulder at the next set of stairs. A drift had also formed there and was growing steadily. "Have you got any pans?" he asked. "Pans?" said Stephen. "How do you mean?" "Pans," Tony repeated and mimed shoveling. "Ah, I see," said Stephen, reaching down to tighten the knot of his robe. "Yes, of course, good thinking." Armed with pots and pans, they began clearing a path up to the next floor. The 5th floor hallway was even more snowbound than the one below. The clouds at the ceiling so dense that they were almost black, a flurry of snowflakes like small feathers falling from them. A few tenants had come out and were looking around, bewildered. The children, however, were having a grand time. 2 were sliding up and down the hall using mats as makeshift toboggans, while others pelted everything in sight with snowballs. "Watch this!" one boy cried as he began tugging down his pyjama bottoms. "Watch me write my name in it!" "Now let's everybody calm down," Stephen declared, rapping the back of his shoveling pan to get their attention. "Everything's under control. You should all just go back inside." "Under control?" a man peeking from behind his door said. "Doesn't look like it to me. I don't give an arm and a leg in rent to put up with this kind of rubbish. Someone needs to come here and sort it out." "I assure you," said Stephen, "we're heading to solve the problem right now. He looked at Tony and Colin, who'd stopped to admire the snow writer's penmanship. "My associates and I believe that we know the source of this phenomenon, and we're going to put a stop to it immediately." The children were unwillingly wrangled back into their respective flats as Tony and the others prepared to head up to the 6th and final floor. The stairs leading up to it were relatively free from snow, but were, instead, encased in a solid layer of ice. Each step was as smooth and shiny as a skating rink, and inch-thick icicles hung from the banisters. It took some effort for them to get up, mainly due to their inadequately shod feet, but also because this floor was enveloped in an even deeper gloom than those below. Hardly a flicker of light from the overhead lamps was able to make it through the thick layer of miniature clouds, and even the hallway windows were blocked by a build-up of frost. The next thing they noticed was the sound of knocking and muffled voices coming from behind the doors of the flats. "Is anyone there? My lock's busted. What's going on?" Tony approached one of the doors and pushed it with his shoulder, but it wouldn't budge. "They must be frozen shut," he said, wrapping a hand in the sleeve of his shirt and brushing frost from the hinges. "That's the one we're after," said Stephen, pointing to the very end of the hall. They carefully made their way to the last door, and Stephen used his robe to wipe the ice from the spy hole before giving 3 hard knocks. At first there was no response, but they then heard definite sounds of movement from behind the door, followed by a telltale scrape as the cover of the spy hole was slid aside. "Dave's not here, man," a voice from inside informed them. "That's what you always say," said Stephen, planting 2 more knocks onto the door for good measure. "We know that you're behind this. What are you playing at?" "Whoa, you gotta calm down, big fella," the voice from behind the door said. "Wouldn't want to do yourself a mischief." "You're the one up to mischief," said Stephen, his temper rising. "I don't know how you're doing this, but you need to stop it." "Nothing to do with me, boss," the voice replied, matter of fact. If you've got a problem with your thermostat, then call the maintenance guy. Oh, I will, said Stephen, puffing out his chest. In fact, I've called the caretaker and the landlord. I've a mind to call the police as well. I'll see you kicked out on your backside at long last. Yeah, good luck with that, said the voice, still sounding totally untroubled. You take care now. They heard the cover of the spy hole slide back. Did you really call someone? Tony asked after a moment. Not yet, said Stephen, but I'm going to. Let's just see what the landlord says when he finds the place like this. The landlord and caretaker were a long time coming. Stephen relayed their conversation to Tony and Colin, saying that the landlord had told him that it was probably just a burst water pipe and that they were to sit tight and not go near any of the electric works or circuit breakers until he and the caretaker arrived. A burst water pipe indeed, Stephen huffed. The man spoke to me like I was a child. We'll see who's overreacting when he shows up. While they stood around and waited, they noticed that a lot of the snow and ice had started to melt. The children, who could no longer be contained, came out to find their wintry playground reduced to pools of slush. Even the top floor doors eventually thawed enough to be opened, their occupants discovering everything soaked in freezing but still very liquid water. After an hour or so, there was no evidence that any snow or ice had been there at all. The dark mini clouds had thinned and then vanished, leaving nothing behind but their water damage. All of the carpets were so sodden that they'd started to lift up and bunch. The walls ran with moisture, the paper peeling and the fiberboards swollen, while fittings and fixtures dripped and bubbled. Many of the tenants had left the building or were making the most of the afternoon sun after the chill from inside. Is everyone okay? Tony said to a group of them. All of them seemed to be fine. I guess we were lucky, one guy said. It looks like it's just the hallways. There wasn't a drop inside our flat. Ours either, said the woman next to him. We're on the ground floor, so I guess it didn't get up to us. Is there really ice near the top? Some of the upper floor tenants nodded and started talking about what they'd seen as a car pulled up and the landlord got out of it. Now, what's all this then? He said as he approached the building. There's no need for everyone to get overexcited from a little leak. Mr. Palmer, said Stephen, stepping to the front of the group. I'm Stephen Williams, the block representative, and Yes, Stephen, I know who you are, said the landlord, waving him away. I do enjoy deleting those report emails of yours. Is someone going to tell me where this leak is? It is not a leak, said Stephen, crossing his arms over his chest. As I explained to you, it was a damn torrent. Caused, I'll have you know, by that miscreant on the 6th floor. He's always up to stuff like this, which you would know if you didn't delete my weekly reports. He's been at the waterworks, has he? The landlord asked. Quite possibly, Stephen replied. This isn't the first time he's been up to no good either. Smoke from chemistry sets, fiddling with people's TV signals. I tell you, the man's a menace. You don't say, said the landlord, scratching beneath his chin. I reckon I know what's going on here. You do? Said Tony. Aye, said the landlord. Chemistry sets, tinkering with electrics, poking around with the water, what they call hydroponics. He pointed up at the top floor of the building. I'll bet you he's got a weed farm up there. Stephen gave a gasp, as dramatic as if he'd been told the guy was building an atomic bomb. You mean drugs? He said. Right here, under our very noses. I've never smelled any, said Tony, so it can't be that under our noses. Nah, said the landlord, I've seen it before. They set up all sorts of pipes and vents and fans. It's a hell of a fire hazard to start with, but if he's been at the water, it can be just as bad. I'm calling the police, said Stephen, fumbling with his phone. Now, let's not be hasty, said the landlord. We'll wait for Brian to get here, to take a look at the water damage, and then I'll go up and have a word with him. No use getting the police involved until we're sure. And we certainly wouldn't want them nosing around while you're assessing how all of this is going to dent the old insurance premium, said Tony, tipping the landlord a wink. What are you, a lawyer? Said the landlord, eyeing Tony suspiciously. Look, here's Brian now. The caretaker's van pulled up alongside the landlord's car, and he got out, looking very unhappy at being called on a weekend. Seriously, Andy, he said, couldn't this have waited until Monday? If there's a drip, they can just put a bucket down. I'm told that it's a bit more than a drip, said the landlord. Get inside and turn the mains off and we can have a look around. After surveying the first 3 floors, the caretaker was dumbfounded. I don't understand it, he said, rubbing the back of his neck in the universal sign of the bewildered tradesman. It should have tripped every circuit in the place, but it's like it only affected the hallways. You say you saw ice? Tony and Stephen nodded. They'd followed the caretaker inside just to see his reaction, if anything. More than just ice, said Stephen. There was snow falling from clouds at the ceiling. Clouds, said the caretaker with a frown. Spray, you mean? Coming from the pipes? Probably hairline cracks. No, they were clouds, said Stephen, actually stamping a foot to bolster his point. It'll be Freon that did it, said the caretaker, from the air conditioning. If that stuff leaks, it can cause ice to build up. Then how come it's gone? Tony asked. If there was a leak, then it must have run out, the caretaker replied. It's a gas, you see. I'll check the canisters. It's probably what blew the pipes, too. He makes a lot of good points, Tony said to Stephen as the caretaker left for the basement. Damn it, Tony, you know what we saw, Stephen protested, and there's a bunch of people out there who'll back us up. Tony looked towards the main entrance. Most of the tenants had now gone back inside as soon as they were told it was okay to do so. They were probably all relieved to hear that their flats weren't going to be left uninhabitable. With that threat gone, they'd be more willing to accept a less fantastical explanation. They heard footsteps on the stairs and looked to see the landlord coming down. Well, no weed farm, he said. I guess I was a bit too quick to point the finger. You spoke to him? Stephen asked. I did, the landlord replied with a nod. Well, you can't just take his word for it, said Stephen. Someone needs to go into his flat and inspect it. That's exactly what I've just done, said the landlord, not seeming to see what all the fuss was about. No weed, no chemistry sets, no nothing. Also, he said he's fed up of you harassing him. It won't do, Stephen. You leave the chap alone. What about messing with the TVs, said Stephen, refusing to back down. I know it was him doing that. Oh, yeah, said the landlord, cocking a thumb over his shoulder. He's got CB radio gear in his back room. Says it was a mistake. He was very apologetic. Honestly, Stephen, I know you like to be cock of the walk around here, but you can't go threatening to have people kicked out. You don't actually have any authority, you know. Stephen made to reply, but instead screwed his face up, turned on his heels, and squelched off towards the door of his flat. The refurbishments took weeks to complete. Every carpet was ripped up and replaced, every wall was stripped and treated before being plastered and repapered. Enormous industrial fans were brought in and left to suck and blow all day and night to remove as much moisture as possible. The residents were fortunate that the event had taken place during the summer. Had it happened in the depths of winter, then the damage would have been truly irreversible. While all of this was going on, no ominous mini-clouds were spotted anywhere in the building, and most people's memory of what had happened started to fade. I suppose it wasn't really snow, some said, more just a layer of frost, and as for clouds, who ever heard of a cloud inside? Stephen remained chief among those who refused to be swayed. Even when the hallways were finally put back to right, he'd keep an eye out for any sign that the freak indoor weather was about to return. It was while he was indulging in one of his few personal pleasures that the flat block's climate took a change again. Every Sunday, Stephen would, instead of taking a shower, draw himself a bath. He had an entire shelf of various scented salts and oils with which to turn the tub into a cauldron of pure relaxation. He'd submerge himself into the water right up to his chin, and then settle there, with a book or a glass of wine, his portable stereo placed on the windowsill and tuned to Classic FM's weekend schedule of mind and body-easing music. During one of these weekly soaks, as he lay, his eyes closed in the tub, a glass of Merlot held between his thumb and finger, the music suddenly stopped. This was very peculiar. He favoured Classic FM for its strict no-ad break policy. Who wants Tchaikovsky's third piano concerto interrupted at any point? Even so, the music came to an abrupt stop and was replaced by the voice of an unfamiliar announcer. We interrupt this broadcast, it said, to bring you an important shipping forecast update. Stephen opened one eye and peered at the stereo. In all his years of listening, the station hadn't ever mentioned a shipping forecast. There are signs of fog, dense cloud and low-pressure zones approaching from the west coast, the announcer continued. It is believed that the epicenter will be in and around the area of flat number 44. Stephen tried to sit up in the tub, but slipped and splashed back down, dropping his wineglass into the water. He struggled back up and wiped the soap suds from his eyes. He then looked at the ceiling of the bathroom and saw that dark tendrils of cloud had begun to form around the light fixture. "It's you, isn't it?" he said, jabbing a finger at the stereo, as though he expected the announcer to hear him. Oddly enough, they did. "Dave's not here, man," the voice said, followed by a tittering laugh. "It's quite ingenious. I do it all with waves, kind of like these." Stephen felt a sudden gust rush through the bathroom, and to his astonishment, the water in the tub drew to the far end, rising up until it sloshed over the sides, leaving all but his feet exposed. The gust then blew the other way, and the bulge of water threw itself to the other end of the tub, splashing into Stephen with enough force to send him sliding onto his back, his legs kicking in the air as he desperately grabbed for the edges of the bath. This tub tempest grew to such a swell, turning Stephen end over end several times, that he was sure he was about to be drowned. What brief glimpses of the surface he managed to get showed the bathroom plunged into a darkness and tumult to rival the worst North Sea maelstrom. Towels flew around in circles like tattered sails, the light dimmed and flickered, and rumbles of thunder growled from the clouds. Just when he thought that he was done for, the last gasp of breath gone from his lungs, Stephen was thrown clean from the bath by the biggest swell yet. He landed on the tile floor in a heap, the water from the tub following him all at once and delivering one final farewell splashing. As the clouds began to disperse and the towels fell from the air, Stephen heard the sniggering laughter still coming from the stereo. "Had enough, have we, Captain Gayhab?" the voice chided. "You tried to murder me," Stephen managed to say between chokes and coughs. He reached out and grabbed one of the towels to cover himself, just in the off chance that the voice from the stereo could also see him somehow. "Nah, I wouldn't say murder," it said. "I just put you on a quick wash cycle. Don't you feel all nice and clean now? You should thank me." "I'm going to come up there and twist your head off your neck," Stephen yelled. "That's what I'm going to do." He got to his feet and stomped out of the bathroom towards the front door. Had he not caught a glimpse of himself in the hall mirror, he'd have charged right out, soaked and naked. He returned to the bathroom to get his robe and found shrill laughter still coming from the stereo. Rather than heading upwards, he instead went down a floor to find Tony. At first, Tony was hesitant, though after Stephen had recounted his ordeal, he was soon on board to go up and confront the guy on the 6th floor. "He'll be expecting you," he said, "but I don't think he saw me that last time. I'll try and talk him into opening the door, and then we'll grab him, okay?" Stephen nodded, a look of harsh determination on his face. They climbed the stairs to the top floor and quietly made their way to the very last door. Tony gestured for Stephen to stay back a few steps, and then approached the door and knocked. After a moment, he heard the spy hole cover slide up. "Hey there, mate," he said. "Dave, is it?" "Dave's not here, man." "Okay. Well, maybe you can help me," said Tony, trying to sound civil. "With what?" "I heard the landlord say that you've got CB radio stuff in there," said Tony. "You know about radios?" "Maybe I do," Dave replied. "Cool. I'm having trouble with this new sound system I've bought," said Tony. "I've got it all looked up, but it just won't work. Is that something you can help me with?" "Look it up online," said Dave. "I've not got time for amateur crap." Tony gave a sigh and took out his wallet. He opened it within clear view of the spy hole and held up a £20 note. "How about that for crap?" "Slide it under the door," said Dave, still sounding suspicious. "Maybe I will look it up online," said Tony, making to return the note to his wallet. Okay, said Dave. "Give me a second." There was a sound of several bolts and chains being undone, and then the door opened just a crack. Dave was a small, skinny man, dressed in an oversized t-shirt, jogging bottoms, and no shoes. He possessed the pallid, vitamin D deficient look of the career shut-in, and fixed Tony with narrowed, somewhat bloodshot eyes. Tony held the note out, as though he were coaxing a skittish dog. Just as Dave was about to take it, he raised a foot and planted it into the door, throwing it fully open. Stephen then appeared from the hallway and dashed forward, trying to push by Tony to get at Dave. "Got you at last," he yelled. "I'm going to throttle you, you nasty little git." "Hey, leave off!" Dave cried, shrinking back into the hallway of his flat as Tony restrained Stephen. "What's this about?" "You know exactly what this is about," Stephen growled, making another swipe towards the cringing Dave. "You're nuts, you are," said Dave. "The landlord says you're not to keep bothering me. I don't know what your problem is, but you can't just come here and start taking swings at me. I'll call the police on you." "How about this?" said Tony, stepping fully between them, his arms outstretched. "First of all, you tell us how you did it." "Did what?" said Dave, his eyes flitting between Tony and Stephen. "Let's not mess about, mate," said Tony. "Everyone else here seems to have swallowed the story, but I know it wasn't just the air conditioner packing up." "It's complicated," said Dave, pouting a little. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," said Tony with a grin. Dave appeared to have a brief internal struggle, but then let his arms hang down at his sides and gave a sigh. "All right," he groaned. "Follow me." Stephen made to enter the flat as well, but Tony held up a hand to stop him. "You wait here," he said. "If he slams this door behind us, then you do call the police." Tony followed Dave down the hall of the flat and then into the back bedroom. It had been a complete understatement when the landlord had described Dave as having some CB radio gear in his room. The entire space was crammed with interconnected devices. Lights blinked, valves hissed, and a tangy metallic scent of transistors permeated the whole flat. Looking from the floor and upwards, Tony then saw a vast network of what appeared to be aerials hanging from the ceiling. Stepping back into the hall, he found that they were in every room. Not a single inch of ceiling space didn't have at least one prong running through it. "It took me a while to get the frequencies right," said Dave, his hands on his hips and now looking more than a little pleased with himself. "At first it just sparked like crazy. I thought I was high up enough here, but I had to recalculate." "You caused all the clouds and stuff with this?" Tony asked. "Yeah," said Dave. "If you work with really high or low frequencies, you can affect all sorts of things in the atmosphere. You know the HAARP array that the Americans have got in Alaska?" Tony shook his head. "Oh, well, this is just a smaller version of that." "Okay," said Tony, "but why did you want to do it?" "Because I could," said Dave with a shrug. "It got a bit out of hand with that whole bathtub thing, though. I didn't mean to hurt the old guy. I just wanted to give him a scare." Tony wasn't sure about any of this. He felt that Dave might be trying to fob him off, though the more he thought about it, he had heard a story about a kid who'd managed to build his own nuclear reactor using radioactive material scavenged from smoke alarms and watch faces, so perhaps a bit of water damage and a flustered Stephen was the better outcome. "Right," he said, "this is where it ends. You need to pack all of this in, or else we will get you evicted, and Stephen will call the police, probably in response to you having fallen down the stairs. Do we understand each other?" Dave nodded. "Good. Now, I'll leave you to it." As he headed down the hall, Dave called after him. "Oh," he said, "about that sound system, I'm no good with those sort of things, sorry. Your best bet is to take it back to the shop." Tony left the flat fully convinced that Dave maybe wasn't the evil genius that he thought himself to be. Stephen proved less easy to deal with. He was still raring to go in and give Dave a good pasting, but Tony managed to calm him down, explaining that if they ever saw any signs of weather manipulation again, he wouldn't hold Stephen back. Fortunately, Dave proved as good as his word. They never saw another mini-rogue cloud, and Stephen's bath stayed calm and placid. In fact, many of the tenants commented on how the weather around the flat block, even when the forecast was awful, always seemed to be unseasonably good. Hello everyone, this is Jack Callahan. Thank you for listening to this story today. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, then you might also enjoy my debut novel, Zombie Nerd and the Half-Term Harrowing, which is available now on Kindle for only $2.99. Why, that's only the price of, well, what can one buy for $2.99 these days? Maybe a sheet of colourful paper that you can use to make a pretty fetching hat. Though, if colourful paper hats aren't your thing, then maybe you'll consider picking up a copy. Like and subscribe for more stories, and have yourself a weird and wonderful day.